All right. Good to see you guys. Appreciate you joining us today. As we continue in our study of the Proverbs, we are today in Proverbs 25, and we're ready to begin verse 16. And we'll look at 16 and 17 together at this time. The King James translation reads, "Hast thou found honey? Eat so much as is sufficient for thee, lest thou be filled therewith and vomited." Coupled with that, verse 17, "Withdraw thy foot from thy neighbor's house, lest he be wearied of thee, and so hate thee." I think there is a legitimate connection to be made between these two verses. They're both verses that deal with good things that can be misused or mismanaged. In the first place, of course, he's talking about honey. And he's cautioning here to enjoy something, a gift like that, in moderation, lest you be made sick by it. Let me just pause here and make a point. Sometimes in reading comments about this passage or some other like it, I'll find something like this. Some wise fellow will say, the Bible cautions us to be just moderate in all things. I'm not always sure what people mean by that. But I certainly don't think that the Bible anywhere teaches that we can dabble in a little bit of everything. For example, here in verse 17 or verse 16, what he's talking about is honey. Not everything is edible. Some things are poisonous. And I think it'd be a great misuse of this passage if we substituted the word poison for the word honey. And we said, have you found poison? Eat so much as is sufficient for thee. Moderation in all things. If we mean by that there's nothing that's absolutely wrong, that's the logical import of those words. That's just not true. But this verse is talking about things that are good and right. Some things we ought to exclude absolutely. There are things that are forbidden to us by the word of God. By the way, the Lord never forbids anything to us that's good for us. When the Lord makes a regulation, it is certainly intended to be a blessing to us. That restriction is. I like what one fellow wrote about this passage, talking about verse 16 and moderation in eating honey. And obviously, there's a wider principle than that involved here. We're not just talking about eating honey as the end all, but the idea of things that are lawful and good in and of themselves can be misused. That's the point. Derek Kidner wrote about this. He said it's a parable of the fatal difference between healthy appetite and greed. And then he added this point. He said, since Eden, man has wanted the last ounce out of life, as though beyond God's enough lay ecstasy, not nausea. That's a good point. Men think, well, if God says don't go further than this, there's something good he's trying to keep me from. That's never true. Never true. Moses said it long ago. The Lord gave us these precepts for our good always. And when God gives us a restriction, it's for our good always. So some things are forbidden to us. They're not good for us. Things that are not forbidden to us can be misused. And so he says, be cautious about abusing what's good by overindulging, by overdoing, and bringing a bad effect on oneself. And having made that point, I think we can see a connection with the next verse, where he talks about withdraw thy foot from thy neighbor's house. Here's another good thing. Visiting, having a neighbor, having a friend, having that fellowship, maybe now more than ever in the circumstances in which you're in, where we're told to stay inside and don't. We appreciate that as we have been restricted more in dealing and traveling and so on. We are looking forward to the end of that. We are blessed, and we realize how blessed we are to be able to visit with those that we care about and care about us. But just like with honey, good things can be abused. And so, what is the lesson in verse 17? Read it again. Withdraw thy foot from thy neighbor's house, lest he be weary of thee, and so hate thee. As I have read after some smart fellows, some of them have thrown up these old sayings like there's a quote, I think it's attributed to Robert Frost initially, that good neighbors make good fences. That's the lesson this guy said we ought to get from this. I don't know if that's the case or not. Another fellow said, quoted the old saying about after the third day, fish and company become distasteful. You've heard something like that, you know. Um, I don't believe that the wise man here is in any way trying to suggest to us that uh, friendships and relationships ought to be superficial. And that really is what the Lord is upholding for us, is a relationship where we just sort of nod and wave, and we don't really talk about our problems or share our life, and we don't want to hear about them either. We just want to keep it light, superficial. You stay over there, and I'll stay over here. I don't think that's what the passage is saying. I don't think that's at all the view of friendship in the Bible. There are a great number of passages that I think do remind us about extending ourselves, helping even our enemies. Much less our much more our friends. Um, so I do think friendship, relationships with our neighbors, with our family, with those that we love and care about, is not intended to be superficial. And I don't think the passage here is recommending to us a lifestyle where we are prohibited from visiting, and that it's all a bother and all a sham, and we really don't care about other people. That's a terrible attitude to have. So, what is the verse saying? It's saying something, isn't it? Yeah, I think it is. I think when he talks about withdrawing your foot from your neighbor's house, again, it's more in line with abuse. It's more in the line of that which is overindulging, overdoing. Um, I like what Mr. Alden wrote about this passage. He said that the lesson here involves the wisdom of knowing when you might be an inconvenience and when you're not. It deals with, as he said, the sensitivity to the feelings of others. I think that is the key. And what this verse is commending is not relationships where we really don't have much to do with each other and don't want to have much to do with each other. We don't want to spend time with each other. No, that's not a virtue. But I do think that what the verse is reminding us of is that you can overdo a good thing. I got a friend of mine, and he has a great way of putting things. And one day he reminded me, he said, the thing about telephone calls, they're always made at the convenience of the caller. That's a logic impossible to argue with. That's right. I call you up when I've got time to talk. Now, what you're doing, I don't know, but I ought to think about that. And I can't know, I'm not clairvoyant, but maybe I can ask, is this a bad time? And trust you as my friend to tell me. Yeah, this is really, let me call you back in an hour, or let me call you back this evening, or 10 minutes, or no, it's great time. But just, I think what the proverb is commending is that thoughtfulness that recognizes that because it's a good time for me, it may not be a good time for you. And I can be extremely thoughtless. And there's no excuse to be thoughtless, not even with your friends, not even with your family. Because we love somebody and are close to them, there's no reason to be disregarding of their feelings or abusive of the circumstances. So I think that's what he's commending here. He's not saying that let all relationships be superficial and let everybody just stay away from each other and not be involved in each other's lives or not share each other's company. Of course not. What he is saying is, do be thoughtful and consider the other fellow's circumstances. Um, one fellow wrote about this passage. He said, we're reminded that consideration and courtesy ought not to be disregarded by trading on the fact of friendship. He calls on us not to be oblivious and insensitive to the feelings of others. I do think that's the point. Now, there's another point that one fellow made that I thought was worth repeating. And he said, while there may be times that even for somebody we love, it may not be a great time to visit them, to call them, and so on. They have special circumstances there that they might need to tend to, and I might be intruding. But he said, Mr. Bridges, it was. He said, that's never true about God. That's one difference in earthly friendships and our relationship with God. Even those that we love and that love us, they might be in some way consumed by circumstances, and it may not be a convenient time for them to see us. That's never true in our relationship with the Almighty. Blessed be God, he says. There is no need of this caution and reserve in our approach to him. Our earthly friend may be pressed too far, but never can we come to our heavenly friend unseasonably. Good point. Good point. Okay. In verse 18 of our text, let's go and look at another one, another proverb. Verse 18 in the Old King James reads, a man that bears false witness against his neighbor is a maul and a sword and a sharp arrow. That's a very graphic picture he draws, isn't it? He makes a comparison with a maul, which is a blunt instrument of some kind. Some have pictured the idea of a heavy wooden hammer or a mallet or a club. That'll bruise a fellow up pretty good. And a sword will run a fellow through, and an arrow likewise will pierce even the heart. It can be a deadly wound that those bring. And so he makes the comparison between those three deadly instruments and something else that may seem much more innocent, but that is really just as deadly. The King James reads, a man that bears false witness. If you look up the words that make up this word in the original language, false witness, bearing false witness, it literally is the expression that means to answer questions. And there's something implied in this. Mr. Jefferson Fawcett and Brown suggest bearing witness literally answereth questions as before a judge against his neighbor. I think you can make the case that this is language that fits well in a legal circumstance. Now, other translations have taken this in a broader context. One of the Modern Speech translations, the God's Word translation, reads like a club and a sword and a sharp arrow, so is a person who gives false testimony against his neighbor. That sounds like a very formal legal situation, doesn't it? But another, the contemporary English version, which is more of a paraphrase, suggests, quote, telling lies about friends is like attacking them with clubs and swords and sharp arrows. So it might be broader, giving testimony in a formal sense, or just telling lies, maybe far away from a courtroom, and yet still, a lie is a powerful weapon that can do as much damage as a club or a sword or an arrow can. Now, that's a fact. And it says a great deal to us about the power of a lie. We've all read those stories. They are real. about people who maybe have spent 30 or 40 years in jail based on false testimony. Either somebody just flat out lied about them, or they gave testimony misidentifying somebody. A terrible thing. Here's the idea of the tongue, of speech, false speech, that can do no little damage to an individual. There are a lot of Bible examples along that line. A couple that come to mind. If you have a Bible, turn with me back over to the book of 2 Samuel. And in 2 Samuel 9, we're introduced to two men, a man named Ziba and a man named Mephibosheth. And you may well be familiar with this story. But it's a fascinating story about these two fellows. Now, Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan. Jonathan was the son of King Saul. So back before David was king, the crown resided in Benjamin. And Saul was king, and Jonathan is heir apparent. But God had made the decision. I'm not going to continue with the house of Saul. I'm going to find another dynasty, and we'll begin with David. Now, Saul became aware of that decision, and instead of yielding to God, he rebelled by trying to kill David. He was unsuccessful. Jonathan, Saul's son, who had so much to gain, was a man of high character who loved David. They were good friends, dear friends. And there's a story told about how that before David fled for his life from King Saul, that Jonathan engaged in an oath with David, in which he made David to promise that when he did become king, and Jonathan was sure that was going to happen. And I'm sure he also recognized the fact that if that happens, I'm going to be gone. My life will be cut short as well as my father. But he said, when that happens, I want you to deal kindly with my family, with my offspring. Now, that had happened 15 years before the story here in 2 Samuel. David had been rather busy. He had been chased around by Saul for a time. And even after Saul was killed, and Jonathan, likewise, in a last battle there at Mount Gilboa, David was quite busy. He was anointed king, but the house of Benjamin, the house of Saul, continued to try and hold the crown. They did for about 7 years. So there was a split there, David ruling down in Hebron. And then eventually David was by acclaim king over all the land. And after that time, and after things settled, we now have the setting of 2 Samuel 9, when David said, is there any yet that is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And there was of the house of Saul a servant whose name was Ziba. And when he had called unto him David, there was a servant of Saul named Ziba. And when they had called unto him, David the king said unto him, art thou Ziba? And he said, thy servant is he. And the king said, is there not yet any of the house of Saul, that I may show kindness of God to it? And Ziba said unto the king, Jonathan hath yet a son which is lame on his feet. If you go back over to chapter 4, you find that when this Mephibosheth was just 5 years old, I believe it was, when his father was killed on Mount Gilboa and all that turmoil took place, they were fleeing, and one of his nurses looking after him, grabbed up the young boy. And in the process of fleeing, he fell, and he was made lame. He had a severe injury that crippled him for the rest of his life. So that's who he's talking about. And the king said unto Ziba, now Ziba had been a servant of Saul, but I might add this point that it's Josephus, I think it is, the Jewish historian from the first century, not an inspired man, but as he tells this story, he adds the point that Ziba was Saul's freedman. So after the death of Saul, apparently, Ziba had been freed from his servitude. But now he's been called on about his old master's family and wanting to know, is there yet someone from Jonathan's family, David says, that I can show kindness to? Yeah, there's one son, and he's over across the river, staying with the house of Machir, the crippled son of Jonathan, Mephibosheth. So David sent over there and brought him back. Can you imagine what Mephibosheth might have thought? You know, the rivalry between Benjamin and David had been a strong one. I'm sure David was in the right in what he did, but Mephibosheth, I believe, was truly afraid. He might have thought that David was going to wipe out his life, uh, maybe settling a score, maybe just a potential rival, whatever it might have been. But when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, verse 6, the son of Saul, was come to David, he fell down on his face and did reverence. And David said to Mephibosheth, he said, uh, uh, fear not, verse 7, for I will surely show kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake, and will restore thee all the lands of Saul thy father, that thou mayest eat bread at my table continually. He said, I want to bring you back from exile. I want to set up again your father's estate, the old royal estates, that might be an income source for you, but I want you to reside here with me, not up in Benjamin. I want you to be here and sitting like one of my sons at my table. Now, this was just a bolt from the blue. He bowed himself, Mephibosheth did, verse 8, and he said, what is thy servant that thou shouldest look upon such a dead dog as I am? Dogs were not exactly the cuddly creatures that we think of today. They were considered sort of the wild varmints, and the dead dog was especially despised. So this is about the worst picture you could think of. He said, I'm a dead dog, and yet here you are showing me this kindness and treating me with such respect, and I don't deserve any of this. Well, verse 9, the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said unto him, I have given unto thy master's son all that pertained to Saul and to his house. Thou therefore and thy sons and thy servants shall till the land for him, and bring in the fruits, that thy master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, thy master's son, shall eat bread always at my table. And verse 10 adds this note, that Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Now again, if Josephus is right, and it's very much consistent with this Ziba had been a servant. He had been in bondage to the house of Saul, but he had been freed from that. He had his own thing going. Large family, servants of his own, and now by David's decree he's being brought back into servitude. Now it'll be his job to take care of the estate of another, namely the estate of this Mephibosheth. But Ziba is outwardly compliant. Ziba said unto the king, verse 11, according to all that my lord the king hath commanded his servant, so shall thy servant do. And so Mephibosheth dwelt, verse 13, in Jerusalem. He did eat continually at the king's table, and was lame on both his feet. Well, story goes on. Trouble arises in David's household, you remember. We have the story, of course, of David's adultery and all the disaster that brought upon David's house. David finds himself endangered by his own son Absalom, who has cunningly stolen away the hearts of the people, raised up a force against David. And David literally is fleeing from Jerusalem, not thinking he's ever going to come back, and frankly, not sure he's ever going to survive this flight away from Jerusalem. But at any rate, the picture in chapter 16 of 2 Samuel, is of David a little past the top of the hill. And he has gathered some followers. To be frank, just looking from outside, these are people who are seemingly backing a losing cause, because Absalom is the one who now is the popular choice. He's come into Jerusalem. He's taking his father's place, cutting ties with his father. He has his father's advisors there. Looks like he's going to pursue David, overtake him, kill him, and a new branch of the family is going to be in charge. But there were some who were yet loyal to David. And on this occasion, Ziba shows up, the servant of Mephibosheth. And he's brought with him a couple of asses. This is 16:1. Saddled, 200 loaves of bread, 100 bunches of raisins, and summer fruits, and a bottle of wine. And the king said to Ziba, "What meanest thou these?" And Ziba said, "Well, the asses are for the king's household to ride on, the bread, the summer fruit, for the young men to eat, the wine, for such that to be faint in the wilderness, that they may drink." And then David asked the obvious question, "Where is thy master's son?" And Ziba said to the king, verse 3, "He abides in Jerusalem, for he said, Today shall the house of Israel restore me the kingdom of my father." Now that's the tale that Ziba told. And it's sad to report that the king believed it. I think we try to be sympathetic with David. He certainly was under a lot of pressure on this occasion, and was not looking to have many arguments with anybody that rallied around him. But he bought this land. That the reason why Mephibosheth is not here is he's back in Jerusalem expecting any minute to be made king. Now, as we look at it, detached by all this time and without all the pressure that David was feeling, it's not hard for us to see this is a ridiculous lie. Actually, the scripture in the dispute between these two men never comes out and gives us a verdict. Now, there are some people who believe Ziba. I find that fantastic. I think this guy's a skunk. I think he's here lying about a fella that cannot come on his own. He makes up this story. I mean, what kind of fool would you have to be? Is there anything in the actual words or deeds of Mephibosheth that would suggest that he is this foolish or this treacherous? That he would turn against David, thinking that somehow he was going to wind up king in this scenario. How? How is this going to happen? You think Absalom is going to see, oh, there's Mephibosheth. I think I'll yield to him now. You think Absalom was that kind of guy? You think anybody thought Absalom was that kind of guy? It's just the whole story is so ridiculous when you break it down. And yet, at this moment in time, David swallows it hook, line, and sinker, as they say. And he says in verse 4, "Behold," he says to Ziba, "thine are all that pertained unto Mephibosheth." And Ziba, humble man that he is, he says, "I humbly beseech thee that I might find grace in thy sight, my Lord, O King." Well, David's got other fish to fry right now. He's just trying to survive this true flood of trouble. Well, he does. And through the providence of God, Absalom is defeated, and David now is returning to Jerusalem. And you turn over to chapter 19, and we pick up the last part of this story. And when David returns, Mephibosheth is there to meet him. In verse 24, Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. And he had neither dressed his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day that the king departed until the day that he came again in peace. That doesn't back up Ziba's story, it seems to me, that he thought somehow he was going to come out ahead of all this. It looks like a fellow to me that's been in great mourning since the day David left. Well, verse 25, David asked him, he said, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth? Why didn't you come?" And in verse 26, we find the answer. He says, "My Lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For thy servant said, I will saddle me an ass that I may ride thereon and go to the king, because thy servant is lame. And he," talking about Ziba, "has slandered thy servant unto my lord the king. But my lord the king is as an angel of God. Do therefore what is good in thine eyes. For all my father's house were but dead men before my lord the king. Yet thou didst set thy servant among them, that they may eat at thine own table. What right have I, therefore, to cry any more unto the king?" And David moderates his former decree this way. He says, "Thou and Ziba divide the land." And Mephibosheth says, "As long as you're well, none of the rest of it matters." Well, I just make this point. This illustration is a great example, I think, of our text about the power of a false word. I mean, you can take a club and beat Mephibosheth, but you can have the same kind of effect with just a carefully placed slander, just a twisting of the story, neglect of this detail or the truth, or just a flat out lie. You can separate a man from his beneficiary. You can make a good man into a traitor with a well-placed lie. I guess one more story, if you'll bear with me, that comes to mind rather obviously. We're going ahead in time now, probably 120 or 30 years, in 1 Kings chapter 21. Here's another story about the power of a lie. You know this story. It relates to a king. By this point in time, the kingdom is divided. And up north in the kingdom we know as Samaria or Israel, there is a man named Ahab on the throne. And Ahab has a summer palace up in Jezreel, a beautiful valley that is Draylen, that runs along the north part of the land of Israel, that connects the coast, the sea coast, with the Jordan Valley. It's fertile land, still is some of the most fertile land around. And the king had a summer palace up at Jezreel, and it's happened to be adjacent to land owned by uh, a good man, a righteous man by the name of Naboth. And the king wanted Naboth to sell him his vineyard. And Naboth could not do so because it was a family inheritance, and according to the law, it was not lawful to sell off the family inheritance. So Naboth had to refuse. And Ahab, being who he was, pouted and fussed about that. And it just so happens that Ahab was married to a woman that we've all heard of by the name of Jezebel. And when Jezebel heard her husband moaning and complaining about not having this vineyard, not being able to get his hands on it, her response was, "Well, you the king or not? Let me handle it." And here's a good reminder, by the way. Don't ever let Jezebel handle anything for you, because people like Jezebel have no scruples. And you'll be joining up in partnership with some evil when you leave it to a Jezebel. And that's exactly what happened. The story in 1 Kings 21 involves how Jezebel took the king's signet, wrote letters in his name. This is down in verse 8. Sealed them with his seal, and sent them to the elders and nobles in the city there where Naboth resided. And she wrote instruction in the king's name along this line: proclaim a fast, set Nabal in a prominent place, have two men, find two worthless, sorry men. They're identified later in the text as men of Belial. Belial is a name, just what they call transliterated. It's just brought over from the original language. Literally, if we translate the word, it suggests the idea of without profit. Here's a worthless individual. a wicked individual, morally worthless. So here, two men, because you had to have two witnesses to put a felon to death. So just pick out two of the most worthless fellows you can find and have them falsely accuse Naboth. Have them publicly at this public gathering point him out and say, we both heard this man blaspheme God and the king. Then carry him out, stone him with stones till he died. That's exactly what they did. They did as Jezebel had sent unto them, verse 11. You think about the power of a lie, this evil plan that resides in the heart of Jezebel, that was made possible by the acquiescence and the weakness of her husband, that led these city officials then to call on these worthless scoundrels. This lie working through every level wound up in the innocent blood of Naboth. He was killed, and Jezebel got word. Jezebel comes, tell her husband, guess what? The vineyard just went on the market and you won. And the story goes on from there. We'll not get into all the story, but eventually this was a very expensive vineyard indeed. It didn't just cost Naboth's life, it cost the life of the king as well. But the power of a lie, a false witness against a neighbor is like a maul and a sword and an arrow. There are a lot of examples along that line. And by the way, not the last time this has happened, but I'll tell you, every time it happens, it's hateful to God. You know, in Proverbs 6, a long time ago, we were in Proverbs 6, we looked at this passage. This is where, you remember, we find this language, there's 6 things that the Lord doth hate, yea, 7 are an abomination to him. And he gives a list here of 7 things that God hates. And this is what he says, verse 17, I'm sorry. Chapter 6 of Proverbs and verse 17. Here are the 7 things that God hates: a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that deviseth wicked imaginations, feet that are swift, running to mischief, a false witness that speaks lies, and he that sows discord among the brethren. Like one fellow said, there's 7 sins that God hates, and 2 of those sins are lies. That says something about God's hatred for lies. The Proverbs teach us a wise man will recognize not only that God hates such behavior, but such is so powerful, so deadly. You just as well go hit a man on the top of the head with a club as to do what Jezebel did to Naboth, what I think Ziba did to Mephibosheth. And by the way, there's no guarantee that that might not happen to us. We might hold ourselves pure, but we may be the victim of such a campaign. Maybe you have been. What do you do in such times? Well, I think prayer is certainly in line. As we look to the future, I think about the words of the psalmist. This is Psalm 120. He wrote, in my distress I cried to the Lord, and he heard me. Deliver my soul, O Lord, from lying lips and from a deceitful tongue. God has not promised to protect us from all the consequences, but ultimately, the Lord knows the truth. And no righteous person will ever be hurt in the ultimate sense by the cause of the wicked. Okay, let's take one more. I think we have time for one more. This is Proverbs 25 and verse 19. And this passage reads, confidence in an unfaithful man in time of trouble is like a broken tooth and like an a foot out of joint. In the first place, I think we certainly can empathize with the idea of a broken tooth and a foot out of joint. My son-in-law has been struggling, I found out, with some really severe pain and going through some dental issues right now. And he could preach this sermon pretty well, I'm sure, at this point. It's very unpleasant. We've all been there. You know, one thing about a broken tooth, not only is it painful, it's useless. The same is true about the foot out of joint. It's painful and it's useless in any good sense. Now, the comparison is between that circumstance and having confidence in an unfaithful man in a time of trouble. The words here are interesting as well to me. Confidence. This word has as its essence the idea of a refuge. We're looking for refuge, somebody to protect us, somebody to help us. But we look to a treacherous man. That's what the word unfaithful really means. A treacherous man in times of trouble. And that word literally suggests the idea of tightness. You get in a tight spot and you're looking for help, refuge. But if you find a fellow who's a treacherous character, he's about as useful as a broken tooth or a foot out of joint. Worse than useless, painful. He'll let you down. What's the lesson? I think the lesson is you need to be careful in choosing the friends that you have. You know, we have a lot of acquaintances, but then we have friends. These are people that if we got in trouble tomorrow, we'd call on them. You know how you know a friend by testing him ultimately. But you're looking to try to associate with people of high character because you recognize the fact that those are the kinds of people that when things get difficult, they're going to be a blessing to you. It's an important thing to choose our friends well. Young people sometimes are put in situations where they might find all kind of associations that are unworthy, and their parents have that same trouble sometimes. We might choose friends because they got money or because we share a hobby or whatever it might be. But the real basis of friendship, it seems to me, deals with something more important than that. Uh, in finding people of character, folks that you can count on, people that you be pleased to be associated with in good or bad times, is I think at the heart of this passage. I think an obvious application of this in terms of marriage. I think that you ought to marry someone that you feel a deep friendship for as well. We don't just marry a spouse because we think they're pretty or we think they got a good car or whatever superficial thoughts are there, but also because we admire something in that person. And in times of trial and difficulty, you find out what you got. And if you've married someone of character, how blessed you are. And if you've married someone without that kind of character, it's about like having a broken tooth or a foot out of joint. And so I do think that the practical application of this passage is be thoughtful about your associates, and particularly about those that we would call our friends. Build relationships with good people, not just because of some selfish benefit. There are a lot of benefits that come. There's a lot of strengthening and value that comes, not just in times of trial, but finding the right kind of associations. And there are all kinds of dangers that come with those who lack that quality. Again, it might be worthwhile to make this comparison. The greatest friend we have is in heaven, and he never lets us down. We're reminded of the words of James in the New Testament in James 1 and verse 17. Every generous act of giving and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father who made the heavenly lights, in whom there is no inconsistency or shifting shadow. The Lord, in one sense, is the most predictable being that we'll ever encounter because he is consistent in righteousness. And that's a great comfort to us. We know that the Lord is in no way fickle. We know that he means what he says, and that he's a friend that'll be there for us just as he promises. So that's a great blessing. Okay. I appreciate you joining us again, and we'll look to pick up at verse 20 next time. To be safe, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much.